The hallway light flickered, casting long, sharp shadows against the wood grain of the door. Mark stood motionless, his back against the opposite wall. In his hands, the business plan felt heavy. The edges softened from hours of gripping. Silence filled the space between him and the wood, a thick, pressurized quiet that made the sound of his own breathing seem deafening. He stared at the brass handle. It was polished, cold, and entirely indifferent to the fact that his entire future was currently resting in a stack of paper. Down the hall, a clock ticked in slow, rhythmic intervals, each pulse drawing him closer to a decision he was not ready to make. He shifted his weight, his heels clicking against the linoleum, and the sound echoed back to him, hollow and lonely. He did not move forward. He did not turn back. He simply watched the door, waiting for a signal that would never come, feeling the weight of the air pressing against his chest as the opportunity sat just inches away, shielded by a single, locked barrier. Mark looked down. His fingers were shaking. The pages of the business plan rattled against each other, a dry, rhythmic sound that cut through the silence of the corridor. He tried to grip the stack tighter, pressing his thumb into the thick cardstock, but the muscles in his forearms refused to stabilize. He watched his knuckles whiten under the pressure. Every word printed on those pages represented months of lost wages and unpaid bills. If he walked through that door, he was betting his entire survival on a single conversation. He looked at the paper again. The ink seemed to blur as his hands twitched. He knew the numbers by heart. He knew exactly how many days of credit remained before his accounts hit zero. This was not just a meeting. This was the final pivot point between total collapse and a chance at building something real. He forced his hands to hold still, but the tremor remained, a physical manifestation of the risk he was taking. He took a long, sharp breath, feeling the air burn his throat, and stared at the door handle. The metal caught the light, gleaming and unreachable. While his hands continued to betray his attempt at composure, Mark shifted his weight, his shoe scuffing the floor as he turned away from the door. He took one step toward the stairwell, his focus narrowing to the exit sign glowing red at the end of the hall. The urge to leave pulled at his shoulders, a physical gravity dragging him back to the safety of his old life. He saw himself walking out into the street, closing the office door behind him, and returning to the familiar, predictable routine of his previous work. No risk, no judgment, no potential for failure. He reached the halfway point of the corridor, his pace slowing as the silence of the office floor seemed to amplify the internal pressure. He stopped. His hand brushed the wall, the plaster cool and grit-covered under his fingertips. He stared at the elevator buttons, his thumb hovering over the call switch. The thought of his bank account balance surged into his mind, not as a feeling, but as a series of sharp, jagged numbers that demanded he stop the climb. He stood there, frozen in the dim light of the hallway, his body tilted toward the exit while his feet remained rooted to the spot, caught in the grip of a quiet, relentless hesitation that urged him to play it safe. His heart slammed against his ribs. Each beat echoed in his ears, a heavy, rhythmic thud that drowned out the hum of the ventilation system. He felt the rapid pulse in his neck, the skin pulled tight over his collarbone. He closed his eyes and saw the bank statement again. 3 digits, a number that would not cover rent for the next month. The reality of that deficit surged through him, making his breath hitch in his throat. He leaned his forehead against the cool, painted surface of the wall and felt the vibration of his own panic. His legs felt heavy, as if the floor were made of lead. Every nerve ending screamed for him to turn, to walk back to the elevator, to leave the business plan on the floor and disappear into the anonymity of the city. He was inches away from the exit. He reached out to press the call button, his fingers inches from the plastic. His lungs burned. The pressure in his chest peaked, a suffocating weight that left him gasping for air in the narrow space. He was at the final edge of the cliff. One more step toward the exit, or one turn back to the door. He stood paralyzed, the sound of his own racing heart the only thing filling the hall. Mark pulled his fingers away from the elevator button. The movement was stiff, as if he were fighting a physical weight in the air. He turned his body, his boots pivoting on the carpet, and walked back toward the heavy wooden door. His palms were damp. He wiped them against his legs, then reached for the handle. The brass was cold. He gripped it, his knuckles whitening, and leaned his weight forward. The door gave way with a silent, smooth swing. Light from the office spilled out, cutting through the shadows of the hallway. He stepped across the threshold, his eyes locking onto the figure seated behind the desk. The investor looked up, a pen pausing mid-air. Mark did not look at the floor. He did not look for an exit. He kept his posture straight, his chin level, and filled the room with his presence. He took a single, controlled breath, felt the remaining tension drain from his shoulders, and opened his mouth. "I am here to show you how this venture changes the market." The words came out clear, steady, and loud. The sound of his own voice surprised him, ringing against the glass walls. The investor set the pen down and leaned back. The fear was still there, a hum in his veins, but it no longer dictated his movement. The seasons shifted outside his window, leaves turning from green to brittle brown, then falling away entirely. Months of labor culminated on a Tuesday afternoon. Mark sat before the monitor, his fingers hovering over the keys. The cursor blinked, a rhythmic, mechanical pulse against the white background. He clicked the final button. The launch was live. He leaned back, his chair creaking under his weight, and watched the status bar crawl toward completion. The room was quiet, save for the low hum of the cooling fan and the distant, muffled sound of street traffic rising through the glass. He refreshed the page. The dashboard flickered, loading a new set of metrics. He stared at the screen, eyes tracing the rising lines of traffic. Every click, every new visitor, felt like a physical impact against his focus. He reached for a glass of water, his hands steady, until a notification chime cut through the silence. A red badge appeared in the corner of the browser window. He pulled his chair closer. The screen cast a harsh, blue light across his face. He clicked the icon. His pulse jumped, skipping a beat as he looked at the first piece of feedback to arrive from the outside world. The text on the screen was short, jagged, and entirely brutal. It dismissed months of his labor in 3 cruel sentences. Mark felt the blood drain from his face, leaving his skin cold despite the heat of the computer tower. His eyes locked onto the words. He read them again, then a third time. The room seemed to contract around him, the shadows in the corners deepening as his focus narrowed to that single, glowing comment box. His breath hitched, turning into a shallow, ragged rhythm that echoed in his ears. He imagined his friends gathered around a phone, scrolling through this very page, their laughter sharp and dismissive. He could see their expressions, the way they would tilt their heads and mock his ambition. The weight of their hypothetical judgment pressed down on his shoulders, a physical pressure that made his neck ache. His right hand moved toward the mouse. He hovered the cursor over the delete button, his index finger trembling just a millimeter above the plastic surface. A single click would make the comment vanish. A single click would restore his peace. He stared at the blue light, paralyzed by the urge to hide, his finger frozen in the air as the silence of the room turned suffocating. Mark blinked, the harsh light of the screen stinging his eyes. He looked past the words, clicking on the small, generic icon next to the username. A profile page loaded. It was empty. No history, no identity, just a ghost behind a keyboard. The realization settled in his chest like a stone sinking into deep water. This was not a friend. This was not an expert. It was a stranger, likely sitting in a dark room miles away, projecting their own frustration onto his work. The imaginary laughter he had heard moments ago dissolved into the hum of the cooling fan. He took a long, jagged breath and pulled his hand back from the mouse. His fingers curled into a fist, then relaxed. He did not delete the comment. He did not reply. Instead, he opened a new window and began typing a response to his community. He drafted an update, detailing the next milestone of the project with absolute focus. He hit the post button. The screen refreshed, showing his new content rising above the hate. He looked at the negative comment one last time, then minimized the tab. He had traded the need for external approval for the cold, hard reality of progress. He stood up, pushed his chair back, and looked out the window. The fear remained, but it was no longer in charge. The months blurred into a sequence of flickering monitors and cold coffee. Mark pushed his schedule until the lines between day and night vanished. He worked until his eyes burned and his shoulders locked into a permanent, painful hunch. He ignored the fatigue, treating his body like a machine that existed only to fuel the project. Then, the shift happened. A sharp, stinging tension flared in his left wrist. He stopped typing, staring at the joint as if it were a foreign object. He rubbed it, but the discomfort lingered, radiating up his forearm. His mind immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusion. He searched for symptoms, his pulse quickening as he scrolled through pages of medical jargon. Every minor ache became a sign of impending failure. He pressed his fingers against his neck to check his pulse, counting the beats until they blurred together. His heart felt heavy, erratic, and fragile. He stood up, but his knees felt weak, and he convinced himself that his circulation was failing. He sat back down and stared at his hands, watching for the slightest tremor. The fear of external criticism had been replaced by a new, more intimate terror. The fear that his own body was failing him from the inside out. The office was dead quiet. No traffic outside, no hum from the building, just the rhythmic ticking of a wall clock that sounded like a hammer hitting an anvil. Mark sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the blank space above his monitor. Every thud of his heart against his ribs felt like a warning signal. He held his breath to listen closer. It was too fast. It was uneven. He pressed his palm against his chest, tracing the vibration of his own pulse, and convinced himself he could feel a skipped beat. The silence of the room turned into a vacuum, pulling his attention deeper into his own biology. He felt a phantom tightness in his throat and immediately checked his pulse again. His fingers trembled against his skin. Every sensation, from the slight heat in his palms to the shallow depth of his lungs, was cataloged as a symptom of a hidden, terminal collapse. He looked at his reflection in the darkened window. He looked gaunt, fragile, and entirely at the mercy of his own internal systems. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in as he sat paralyzed by the imaginary weight of his own physical decline. He was no longer working. He was merely observing his own decay, waiting for the next tremor to prove his worst fears true. The panic hit a threshold. Mark stared at the screen, saw his own reflection, and realized he was holding his breath. He slammed the laptop shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the empty room. He stood up abruptly, his chair sliding back and hitting the wall. He did not look back at the desk. He did not check his pulse. He walked to the door, grabbed his keys, and stepped out into the biting night air. It was cold. It stung his skin, and the sharp contrast to the stale, heated air of the office cut his anxiety in half. He began to walk across the feld. His legs felt half uncooperative, but he pushed past the stiffness. By the time he reached the end of the block, his breathing had deepened. He forced a rhythm. Inhale for 4 strides, exhale for 4. The focus shifted from his heart rate to the impact of his boots against the pavement. With every mile, the phantom symptoms evaporated. He was not dying. He was moving. He was sweating. He was alive. The loop of worry snapped under the weight of physical exertion. He kept running, leaving the ghost of his fear behind on the pavement, reclaiming his vitality through the simple, brutal act of movement. Mark returned home with his heart steady and his mind clear, but the silence inside the house was different. It was heavy. His partner sat at the kitchen table, the light casting long shadows over a stack of papers Mark had left behind. There was no greeting. Instead, there was a quiet, firm request to set aside the new project. The words were simple. Stay small. Stay here. We are safe like this. Mark felt the contrast immediately. The runner's high vanished, replaced by a cold, tightening sensation in his chest. His partner traced the edge of the table, insisting that his ambition was a threat to their shared peace. They spoke of the risks, the erratic hours, and the instability that growth would inevitably bring. Mark stood by the door, his breath still coming in measured, deep exhales from his run. He looked at the person across from him and saw the boundaries of a life he had been living for years. It was a comfortable, contained existence. To move forward meant to break that container. He realized then that his pursuit of value was being framed as a betrayal of their bond. The choice was laid out in the quiet air. Maintain the status quo and keep his comfort, or accept the possibility of being alone in his pursuit of growth. The ghost of fear was no longer a personal anxiety. It was now a face, a voice, and a demand for him to stop. The air in the room felt stagnant, pressurized by the weight of the ultimatum. Mark remained by the entrance, his boots still dusty from the pavement. Every second he stood there, the distance between him and his partner seemed to grow, despite the fact that they were only feet apart. He looked at the kitchen table, the epicenter of their shared life, and felt a sharp, hollow ache. The demand hung in the air. Shrink his world to preserve their peace. Mark shifted his weight, his muscles coiled and ready to move. He took a single, deliberate step backward, pulling away from the space they had occupied together. The movement was small, yet it sounded like a collapse of everything he had previously accepted. He watched his partner's eyes, searching for a compromise that he now knew did not exist. There was no middle ground between stagnation and evolution. He looked at the door leading out of the kitchen, then back at the person who had been his anchor for so long. The realization was absolute. If he chose to pursue his vision, the foundation of this connection would fracture. He stood at the edge of that final, irreversible choice, feeling the heavy, suffocating grip of the fear of being alone, yet knowing that staying meant the death of his own potential. Mark did not answer with a plea. He answered with silence, then a single, steady shake of his head. The tension broke, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. He turned his back on the kitchen table and walked toward the study. His footsteps were measured, deliberate, and final. He reached his desk, his hands moving with mechanical precision to gather his notes and his laptop. Every item he placed into his bag felt like a weight being lifted. He heard his partner rise from the chair, the sound of wood scraping against tile, but he did not look back. He knew that to turn around was to invite the hesitation he had spent months fighting. He reached the hallway and paused for a fraction of a second, his hand hovering over the doorframe. The house was quiet. The decision was no longer a thought, it was a physical reality. He pushed the front door open, stepping out into the cool evening air. He did not look for a signal to return. He walked down the steps and turned toward the streetlights, his pace quickening with every stride. He had accepted the cost. He was alone, but for the first time in years, the path ahead belonged entirely to him. Mark reached his new apartment, the space echoing with the silence of his choice. He walked into the bathroom, splashing cold water onto his face. The porcelain sink felt hard and unforgiving beneath his palms. He lifted his head, eyes locking onto the mirror. He leaned in, the glass fogging slightly with his breath. He was looking for the fatigue of the last few months, but he found something else instead. Near his temple, a cluster of thin, silver strands caught the light. He blinked, thinking it was a trick of the dim overhead bulb. He adjusted his stance, peering closer. The strands were unmistakable. They were not stray highlights. They were the first visible markers of a decade spent in pursuit of progress. The room seemed to shrink. He touched the hair, feeling the texture, coarse and different. A sharp realization cut through his focus. The years were not infinite. He had spent them fighting battles, building, and pushing. But the clock had been running in the background. The air in the room felt thinner. He pressed his hand flat against the cool mirror, staring at his own eyes. The urgency arrived not as a thought, but as a physical weight in his chest. He was no longer a man with endless time. He was a man running out of it. Mark pulled back from the mirror, the silence of the room pressing against his ears. He moved to his desk and sat, his hands hovering over the stack of project notes that had defined his life for years. He read a line, then another, but the words felt distant. A thought coiled in his mind, persistent and cold. It was too late. He was starting from a deficit, with less time than he had when he began. He reached out to slide the folder into the drawer, intending to push it all away. His fingers grazed the edge of the paper, then stopped. He looked at the empty space on the desk. He thought of the decades ahead, empty if he chose to stop now. He stood up, walked to the bookshelf, and pulled down a heavy, dust-covered manual he had bought months ago but never opened. He carried it back to the desk, the weight of the book grounding him. He cleared the old notes to the side, creating a clear space in the center. He opened the cover. The pages were crisp, the ink sharp. He picked up a pen, turned to the first chapter, and began to read. The fear of being too old remained, but he ignored it, forcing his eyes to focus on the new information until the doubt began to recede. Mark sat in the center of his room, the house silent around him. He stopped reading. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic pulse of the wall clock in the hallway. Each tick felt like a physical impact against the floorboards. He looked at his hands, steady on the desk, then at the window where the light was already fading. The realization hit him, not as a concept, but as a physical weight. Every second he spent waiting was a second he would never reclaim. The fear of death was no longer a shadow in the corner. It was the air in the room. It stripped away the excuses of tomorrow and later. He looked at his phone, a black rectangle resting on the wood, its surface dark and cold. He had avoided this specific call for years, fearing the outcome, fearing the finality of the conversation. Now, the fear of leaving things unsaid felt sharper than the fear of the response. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He picked up the phone. He did not hesitate. He swiped the screen, found the contact he had buried, and pressed the call button. The line connected. He held his breath and waited for the first ring. Mark did not look at the clock again. He kept his eyes fixed on the textbook, his pen moving across the margins of his notebook. The concepts were dense. He had to read the same paragraph 4 times before the logic locked into place. His hand cramped, but he did not stop to stretch. He traced the diagrams with his index finger, mapping out the connections between the data points. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the room into shadow, but he did not reach for the lamp. He worked by the pale glow of his computer screen. When he finally solved the equation, he leaned back and let out a long, slow breath. The doubt that had plagued him, the idea that his brain had lost its edge, dissolved. He was not slowing down. He was accelerating. He turned the page to the next chapter, the paper crisp under his touch. The fear of being too late was a static concept, while the information in front of him was dynamic and alive. He took a sip of cold coffee, felt the bitterness on his tongue, and dove back into the text. He was building something new, and for the first time in years, he felt the momentum of genuine progress. The phone vibrated against his ear. A steady, hollow rhythm. 1 ring, 2, 3. Mark stood by the window, watching the streetlights flicker to life below. His throat tightened. The urge to pull the device away and break the connection surged through his chest, a familiar, phantom reflex. He squeezed his eyes shut, pressed his free hand against the cold glass of the window, and forced his breathing to slow until the panic receded. He would not run. The 4th ring cut through the silence of the room. Then, the line clicked. The sound of someone breathing on the other end filled the space between them. Mark did not wait for the other person to speak first. He straightened his spine, shifted his weight to a firm stance, and opened his mouth. His voice did not tremor. It did not drop. He spoke his name and stated his purpose with a precision he had never possessed before. The words were sharp, direct, and final. He listened to the reaction on the other end, his heart rate steady, his grip on the phone relaxed. The years of hesitation vanished into the air of the room. He was no longer reacting to the world. He was directing his place within it. Mark lowered the phone. The device felt light in his palm, stripped of the weight it had carried for years. He placed it on the desk and stood still. In the corner of the room, the shadows remained. The old doubts, the whispers of failure, and the echoes of hesitation did not vanish. They simply lost their gravity. They were no longer the architects of his choices. He walked toward the door, his boots firm against the floorboards. He did not look back at the desk or the notes that once defined his anxieties. He reached the threshold and pushed the door wide. The hallway beyond was flooded with morning light, bright and unfiltered. He stepped through, leaving the stillness of the room behind. The air outside felt different, colder, sharper, and moving. He walked down the corridor, his pace steady and unhurried. He was not running toward a goal or away from a ghost. He was simply moving, with every step belonging entirely to him. He crossed the threshold into the open space, and for the first time, the path ahead was his to build.